In the heart of summer, four friends, Lisa, Jake, Sarah, and Mike, decided to embark on a road trip that would take them through the picturesque landscapes of the American Southwest. With a packed car, they set out on a journey filled with laughter, adventure, and the promise of unforgettable memories. Their chosen route would lead them through desolate stretches of highway that wound through vast, arid deserts, isolated and remote. As they drove, the scenery transformed from bustling cities to barren wilderness, and the open road seemed to stretch on forever. Lisa, the driver, navigated with precision as Jake, her partner, manned the stereo. Their laughter filled the car, and they sang along to their favorite tunes, their spirits high as they embraced the freedom of the open road. Sarah and Mike in the back seat shared jokes and snacks, their faces illuminated by the ever-present glow of their smartphones. Hours passed, and the group marveled at the stunning vistas that unfolded before them. The landscape was simultaneously awe-inspiring and desolate, a stark reminder of the vastness of nature. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the realization dawned that they were venturing deeper into the isolated desert, with no signs of civilization in sight. "We should probably find a gas station soon," Lisa remarked, her eyes scanning the barren landscape. Jake consulted the map and his smartphone, trying to determine the nearest gas station. There should be one a bit further ahead, but it's hard to tell exactly how far. With growing concern, they continued driving, hoping to reach the elusive gas station before their fuel gauge reached empty. But the hours passed, and their situation grew more precarious. The landscape became increasingly desolate, with no signs of life or infrastructure. The fuel gauge continued its relentless descent, and anxiety filled the car. Jake's phone lost signal, leaving them without GPS or a means to contact anyone for help. The group exchanged worried glances, realizing they were in a dire predicament. "It's been hours since we saw a gas station," Lisa said, her voice tinged with panic. Mike, trying to stay positive, tried to reassure the group. "There's got to be something up ahead, we'll make it." As the last dregs of fuel were siphoned from the tank, the engine sputtered and died. The car coasted to a halt on the side of the highway, surrounded by an endless expanse of desert under the moonlight. Desperation hung heavy in the air as they stepped out of the car and looked around. The silence was dark, broken only by the howling of the wind through the barren landscape. "We can't stay out here," Sarah said, her voice trembling. Mike's face was grim as he surveyed the empty highway. "We'll have to start walking and look for help. Maybe we'll find a gas station or a passing vehicle." With no other option, they set off on foot, clutching their flashlights and whatever supplies they had in the car. The desert night was unforgiving, the temperature dropping rapidly, and the haunting emptiness of the landscape added to their growing fear. Hours turned into a seemingly endless trek, and their energy waned. Sarah and Lisa shivered in the cold desert air, their feet aching from the miles they'd walked. Their hope began to fade, replaced by a gnawing dread that they might never find help in this desolation. Suddenly, Mike spotted a distant glow on the horizon. "Look, there's a light. It could be a gas station or a building. Let's go." Renewed with hope, they quickened their pace, heading toward the distant light. But as they approached, they realized it was not a gas station, but a solitary, dilapidated building that seemed abandoned for years. The flickering neon sign that once declared Oasis Diner hung precariously, its letters missing or askew. Reluctantly, they entered the diner, their flashlights revealing a scene frozen in time. Dust-covered tables and chairs, shattered glass, and tattered menus were strewn about the interior. It was a haunting sight that left them with a sense of foreboding. Mike called out, but there was no response. The place seemed deserted, and its silence was scary. With no other options, they decided to search for any supplies that might help them get back on the road. As they explored the diner, they discovered an old cash register, empty except for a few decaying dollar bills. In the kitchen, they found a pantry with canned goods and bottled water, which would sustain them for a short while. The group debated whether to spend the night in the abandoned diner or continue their journey on foot. The decision was fraught with uncertainty, but the chilling isolation of the desert night outside made the choice clear. They decided to stay and rest before resuming their quest for help at first light. In the diner's back room, they huddled together, trying to find comfort and warmth. They shared stories and jokes to lighten the mood. but the strange surroundings and their dire situation hung heavily over them. Sleep proved elusive, as the hours crept by in torturous silence. The sense of isolation weighed on them, and their growing anxiety made each creak of the abandoned buildings seem like an impending threat. Just as they were beginning to doze off, a haunting sound echoed through the diner, a sound that sent a cold feeling down their backs. It was a faint, creepy melody, like an old music box playing a twisted lullaby. The group's eyes met, their faces pale with fear. "Did you hear that?" Jake whispered, his voice trembling. Sarah nodded, her eyes wide with terror. "It's coming from the kitchen." Mike, with a flashlight in hand, ventured into the dark kitchen. The others followed, their hearts pounding as the haunting melody grew louder. As they entered the kitchen, they discovered the source of the sound. An old music box on the counter, its cracked lid slightly ajar. The music box played its haunting tune with a life of its own, its winding key untouched. The melody had an ethereal quality, as if it were beckoning them to some dark, mysterious place. Terrified and unable to comprehend the phenomenon, they watched as the lid of the music box slowly closed, its music fading into silence. Goosebumps covered their skin, and a sense of dread weighed heavily on their hearts. Before they could react, a figure emerged from the shadows of the kitchen, its presence sending shockwaves of fear through their bodies. It was a haggard, emaciated man, dressed in rags, his eyes hollow and empty. The man's voice croaked as he whispered, "You should have left when you had the chance." The group retreated in terror, their hearts racing as they realized they were not alone in the abandoned diner. The man's ghastly appearance and his cryptic words left them paralyzed with fear. Their instincts kicked in and they ran for the exit, fleeing the diner in a panic. The night had grown colder and the desert was an even more inhospitable place than they had thought. They were filled with a deep sense of dread, unsure of what horrors awaited them in the desolate darkness. As they ventured further into the desert, the echoes of the haunting melody and the spectral presence of the man lingered in their minds, haunting their every step. The night was unrelenting, and their fear grew with each passing moment. Their desperate journey seemed endless, and they were tormented by the belief that they were being pursued by an unseen force. The desert landscape stretched out before them, an unforgiving expanse that offered no solace. Just as exhaustion threatened to overcome them, they spotted the distant glow of headlights. A vehicle was approaching, and they waved their arms frantically, their voices hoarse as they cried for help. The vehicle slowed to a stop and a lone figure stepped out. It was a truck driver, a grizzled man with a weathered face who listened to their story with a mixture of concern and skepticism. "We ran out of gas and ended up in an abandoned diner," Lisa explained, her voice shaking. "We heard a music box playing by itself, and there was a man there who said we should have left." The truck driver's expression darkened and he glanced toward the horizon. "You're lucky I found you. That abandoned diner has a dark history. They say it's haunted by the souls of those who got lost in the desert and never found their way out." With a sense of urgency, the truck driver offered to take them to the nearest town, where they could get the help they needed. As they piled into the truck, their relief was palpable, and they couldn't escape the feeling that they had narrowly escaped a horrific fate. Story 2. In the heart of summer, Mark set out on a cross-country journey to visit his family. The open road stretched before him, inviting him to embark on an adventure filled with excitement and the promise of reunions with loved ones. Armed with a map, a trusty old car, and a sense of adventure, he headed out, leaving behind the bustling city for the wide expanse of the countryside. As Mark drove through picturesque landscapes and quiet towns, he marveled at the diversity of the country. The journey was marked by changing scenery, from lush forests to rolling hills and dusty highways. Along the way, he exchanged pleasantries with friendly strangers, visited quaint diners, and admired roadside attractions. The trip was proving to be everything he had hoped for. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark found himself in a remote stretch of the highway, far from any signs of civilization. The desolation of the area was almost sinister, with miles of empty road surrounded by an expansive wilderness. As he drove, he noticed that his fuel gauge was approaching empty, and the nearest gas station was still miles away. Growing increasingly anxious, Mark kept an eye on the fuel gauge, hoping that he could reach the gas station in time. But as the needle inched closer to E, a sense of unease settled in. He knew he was in a remote area, and the idea of running out of gas in the middle of nowhere was unsettling. The car's engine sputtered, and Mark watched in dread as the fuel gauge finally hit E. The engine died, and he coasted to a stop on the side of the highway. Panic surged through him as he realized the predicament he was in, stranded in a desolate place with no one in sight. Mark's initial reaction was to call for help, but to his dismay, he discovered that his cell phone had no signal in the remote location. He felt a sense of isolation and vulnerability, and his mind raced as he tried to figure out what to do next. Just as he was considering starting the long walk to the gas station, a vehicle approached from behind. A pickup truck pulled up, and Mark watched with a mixture of relief and caution as a burly man in his 40s stepped out. The man wore a worn flannel shirt, and his face was obscured by a scruffy beard. He had a gruff appearance, and Mark couldn't quite read his intentions. "Car trouble?" the man asked, his voice a gravelly baritone. Mark nodded, trying to sound as composed as possible. "Yeah, I ran out of gas. I was just about to start walking to the gas station." The man's response was a slow, almost menacing smile that made Mark freeze. "No need for that, friend. I can help you out." Reluctantly, Mark accepted the man's offer of assistance. The stranger retrieved a gas can from his truck and began pouring the fuel into Mark's tank. As he worked, he engaged Mark in conversation, asking about his journey and his destination. Mark was polite but guarded, sensing something unsettling about the man. There was an air of intensity and a strange gleam in the stranger's eyes that made him uncomfortable. Still, he couldn't afford to turn down the help, especially in such a remote area. As the man finished refueling the car, Mark tried to offer him some money as a token of appreciation. The stranger waved it away with a dismissive gesture. "No need for that. I'm just glad I could help out a fellow traveler." Mark felt a growing sense of unease as the man returned to his truck. He thanked the stranger and got back into his car, eager to leave the desolate stretch of highway behind. However, as he pulled away, he noticed the stranger getting into his truck as well, and an uncomfortable feeling gnawed at his gut. Mark couldn't shake the sensation that he was being followed. He tried to rationalize it, telling himself that the man might be going in the same direction, but the unease persisted. The stranger's presence and the strange conversation they had shared haunted him as he drove on. Miles passed, and the highway seemed to stretch on forever. The stranger remained a constant presence in Mark's rearview mirror. Never too close, but never too far either. The paranoia grew, and he couldn't escape the nagging feeling that something was horribly wrong. To put his mind at ease, Mark decided to exit the highway at the next opportunity, hoping to lose the stranger on the back roads. He made a quick turn, leaving the main road behind, and tried to find a place to lay low. As he navigated the winding roads, he glanced in his rearview mirror, relieved to see that the stranger was nowhere in sight. Mark drove for several more miles, feeling a renewed sense of freedom. It seemed that he had successfully eluded his unwanted companion. He decided to stop at a nearby rest area to gather his thoughts and plan his next move. But just as he pulled into the empty rest area and parked his car, a sense of dread washed over him. The stranger's pickup truck had pulled in behind him, and the man emerged from the vehicle, wearing the same scary smile as before. Mark's heart raced as he realized the stranger had been following him all along. He considered his options, but the isolation of the rest area left him with few choices. The stranger approached his car, and Mark locked the doors, his hand trembling as he reached for his cell phone, still hoping for a signal. The stranger tapped on the window, his grin growing wider and more unsettling. "You tried to lose me back there, didn't you? That's not very nice." Fear coursed through Mark's veins, and he had no doubt that the stranger's intentions were far from benign. Desperation gripped him, and he reached for the car's ignition, preparing to make a hasty escape. But before he could react, the stranger produced a knife from his pocket, its blade glinting in the dim light. He began to slash at the tires of Mark's car, rendering it immobile. Panic and terror consumed Mark as he realized the dire situation he was in. With his car incapacitated, Mark had no choice but to open the window and face the menacing stranger. The man's smile had transformed into a sadistic grin, and he leaned in closer, the glint of the knife blade dancing in his eyes. "You shouldn't have tried to run, friend," the stranger whispered, his voice dripping with malice. Just as Mark feared the worst, the rest area's silence was shattered by the distant wail of sirens. The approaching police cars' flashing lights painted the scene with a sense of hope. The stranger, realizing the imminent danger, retreated and fled to his pickup truck. The police car skidded to a stop and officers apprehended the stranger, who struggled violently but was eventually subdued. Mark's heart pounded with a mixture of relief and gratitude. The police explained that the man was a known criminal with a history of violence and assault. They had been tracking him for some time, and Mark's call for help had led them to the rest area just in the nick of time. Story 3. David and Sarah, a married couple, set out on a romantic getaway to celebrate their anniversary. They decided to explore the less traveled back roads of the countryside, hoping to discover hidden gems and make memories together. The open road stretched before them, and they were filled with anticipation and excitement. The journey was punctuated by laughter, heartfelt conversations, and moments of pure happiness. They cherished the serenity of the open road, taking turns behind the wheel, and stopping at quaint roadside diners and antique shops. One evening they found themselves on a winding, desolate road, far from the bustling towns they had grown accustomed to. The remoteness of the area was almost creepy, with dense forests on either side of the road and no other vehicles in sight. As the day waned and the sun dipped below the horizon, David noticed that their fuel gauge was nearing empty. Sarah glanced at the gauge and said, "We should look for a gas station soon. The nearest town should have one." With growing concern, they continued driving, their eyes scanning the forested landscape for any signs of civilization. But as the fuel gauge inched closer to E, a sense of unease began to settle in. David muttered, "We're running low on gas. I hope we find a station soon." Just when their anxiety was reaching its peak, they spotted a small road sign that pointed to a nearby gas station. Their relief was palpable as they followed the signs to the station, anticipating a chance to refuel and continue their journey. However, when they reached the gas station, their optimism turned to dismay. It was dark and abandoned, a relic from a bygone era. The pumps were old and rusted, with no sign of life around. It became clear that the station had been out of operation for years. With a heavy heart, David turned to Sarah and said, "It looks like we'll have to find another station. Let's hope there's one not too far away." As they continued driving down the winding road, the forest grew denser and the sense of isolation more pronounced. Sarah, peering at the map, suggested that there was another gas station a few miles ahead. But as they drove on, there was still no sign of civilization, and their fuel gauge inched perilously close to empty. The anxiety that had been simmering for some time began to boil over. David felt a growing sense of dread, but he didn't want to burden Sarah with his fear. Instead, he kept his eyes on the road, searching for any sign of hope. Just when they were beginning to lose hope, they spotted a small, secluded house nestled in the woods. A dim light glowed in one of the windows, offering a faint glimmer of hope. David decided to stop and ask for directions or help, thinking that maybe the residents would have a gas can or some information about the nearest station. As they approached the house, the atmosphere grew increasingly strange. The dense woods seemed to encroach upon the road, and the night was eerily silent. The sense of isolation was overwhelming, and it felt as if they were the only people for miles around. David parked the car in front of the house, and they hesitantly approached the front door. As they reached the porch, they could hear faint, muffled voices from inside, and the sound of clinking utensils and dishes. Sarah whispered, "It seems like a family dinner. Let's knock and ask for help." David agreed, and he raised his hand to knock on the door. But before he could do so, the door swung open with a creak, revealing a tall, imposing man in his 50s. He had a scruffy beard and intense, unblinking eyes that seemed to pierce through David and Sarah. "Can I help you?" the man asked, his voice steady but devoid of warmth. David stammered, "We're out of gas and we were wondering if you could point us to the nearest gas station. We saw your lights on and thought maybe you could help." The man's smile was strained and his gaze never left them. "I'm sorry, but we're quite far from the nearest gas station. You're welcome to come inside and wait for morning, but we can't offer any gas." As they entered the house, the weird atmosphere only intensified. The interior was strange, and the dining room was filled with people, their faces blank and devoid of emotion. It was as if the entire family had been frozen in time, trapped in a strange tableau. The man introduced David and Sarah to his family, but there was something deeply unsettling about the encounter. The family members barely acknowledged their presence, and their dinner table was laid out with strange, unappetizing dishes. The air was heavy with silence, punctuated only by the sound of utensils scraping against plates. As David and Sarah sat at the table, the man's demeanor grew more unnerving. He continued to stare at them, his gaze unyielding. "You must be hungry after your journey. Please help yourselves to dinner." David and Sarah glanced at the peculiar dishes before them, unable to hide their discomfort. The food appeared to be a mix of unidentifiable ingredients, and an odd odor permeated the room. They politely declined the offer, but the man insisted, his insistence growing increasingly unsettling. Hours passed, and the couple found themselves trapped in a strange, unsettling limbo. The family remained unresponsive, their strange tableau unchanged. David and Sarah felt like unwelcome guests, and the fear that had been simmering beneath the surface grew more pronounced. Finally, as the clock approached midnight, the man rose from the table and approached David and Sarah, his eyes fixed on them with an unsettling intensity. "You can't leave. You must stay the night." Sarah's heart raced as she asked, "Why can't we leave? We just need to find a gas station." The man's response was chilling. "You can't leave because you've seen too much. You know our secret, and we can't allow you to leave." In an instant, the situation escalated from strange to horrifying. The man's demeanor turned menacing, and his family members rose from the table, their blank faces now contorted with malevolence. David and Sarah realized that they were in grave danger. With adrenaline surging through their veins, they made a desperate attempt to escape. They bolted for the front door, but the man and his family pursued them with a chilling determination. As they raced back to their car, the night seemed to close in on them, the forest swallowing them whole. The pursuit was relentless, and the man's sinister laughter echoed through the woods. Desperation drove David and Sarah to their limits as they tried to outrun their pursuers. They sprinted through the thick woods, their breaths ragged and their hearts pounding. But the family's knowledge of the terrain gave them an advantage, and the pursuit showed no signs of relenting. Just when it seemed that David and Sarah were doomed, they stumbled upon a small cabin in the woods. The door was unlocked and they burst inside, barricading themselves in. The family members arrived moments later, their hands pounding on the door with a terrifying, relentless rhythm. David and Sarah huddled together, their hearts racing as they realized the direness of their situation. The cabin's interior was shrouded in darkness, and they knew that they had no means of escape. The scary sounds of the family members outside, their footsteps and taunts, filled the cabin with dread. As the night wore on, the couple's hope began to fade. The sinister family showed no signs of giving up, and the relentless pursuit had become a nightmare that refused to end. The darkness was their only ally, but it couldn't shield them from the malevolent presence lurking just outside the cabin. In the darkness, David and Sarah clung to each other, their fear and desperation consuming them. The horrifying realization that they were trapped in a remote cabin with no hope of escape, at the mercy of a sinister family, was a nightmare come to life.